Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about another cult. This cult was led by a man named Peter Moses Jr. And this cult followed the doctrine of the Black Hebrew Israelites, which we'll discuss more in detail later. But Pete Moses was on the very extreme end of this movement, and he started to believe that he was a prophet. He started up his own little sect with polygamy being a major part of his teachings, and he began to collect wives and have lots and lots of babies with these wives. And this turned into a very abusive, dangerous environment for all the women and children living in the house. The women were basically forced to be sex slaves, and Pete was constantly looking for new women to recruit into his cult. And one day he reconnected with an old friend from high school, a woman named Antoinetta McCoy. And this is when the violence in the house reached a new level. And in the end, two totally innocent people lost their lives in the most brutal way.
The bodies of McCoy and Higginbotham were discovered in the backyard of a Durham home earlier this month. Police say all the suspects and victims were part of a polygamous sect called the Black Hebrews.
So that is what we'll be talking about today, but before we get into the case, let's briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Wild Grain. If you love fresh baked bread and pastries, but you don't love going through the trouble of baking from scratch, or maybe you just don't have the time, a Wild Grain subscription just might be the answer for you. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and fresh pastas. But they have a wide range of other items as well. They have cookies, pasta sauces, pizzas, waffles, donuts. They offer variety boxes, gluten-free, vegan boxes, and they've just introduced their brand new protein boxes. There really are so many items for you to choose from, and you get to choose which items you want in your box, so you can customize it to your own dietary and meal planning needs. They're constantly adding new items to their menu. They also offer delicious seasonal items. Every product bakes from frozen in 25 minutes or less with no thawing required. Just take it out of the freezer, pop it into the oven, and in 25 minutes or less, it's ready. That's how simple and convenient Wild Grain has made it. This box contained ham and cheese croissants, chocolate croissants, giant chocolate chunk cookies, biscuits, churned French butter, sourdough bread, and regular croissants. We really enjoyed these little biscuits. They were very good with the churned French butter and a little bit of honey. And the Wild Grain sourdough is always a staple for us over here. We love the sourdough. Wild Grain has more than 40,000 five-star reviews, and they've also been voted the best food subscription box by USA Today for 3 years in a row, which isn't surprising to me because Wild Grain really is such a great service. And they're also committed to giving back. They donate 2 meals to a food security nonprofit of your choice at no extra cost. You guys know how much I love Wild Grain. They've been supporting this channel for a while now, and I absolutely love working with them. And if you want to check out Wild Grain, just click the link in the description box and use my code SUMMER to get $30 off your first box, plus you'll get free croissants for life. A huge thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. It's 2010 and 26-year-old Antoinetta McCoy has just received a Facebook message from an old high school crush who she hadn't seen in years. And at first, it seemed like this random message could not have come at a better time. Antoinetta, or Neta as her friends and family called her, had been feeling very lonely lately, and she was really excited when she saw this message. Neta was born on June 25th, 1983, and she grew up in Washington, D.C. with her 2 siblings, and they were raised by her mother. This area of Washington, D.C. where Neta was raised was not a very safe area. According to Neta's family, this was a neighborhood where you had to become street smart at a very early age. You had to learn to be tough, and you couldn't let people push you around. But Neta was just not that type of person. She was very shy. She was very introverted. She wasn't the type to be argumentative or disrespectful or fight back. She was just a very sweet girl who didn't want any trouble. Neta's main outlet in life was her faith. She was super involved in her church, and she would spend the majority of her free time either at church or reading her Bible. And because Neta wasn't like a lot of her peers, growing up she didn't really have many friends and she didn't date much. She always felt like an outsider within the community. But she did make a connection with one person in high school. She had a major crush on one of the guys in her class, and this guy was named Pete Moses Jr. Some sources say that Neta and Pete actually dated very briefly in high school. Others say that they were just friends. But either way, Neta always had a crush on Pete, but he ended up moving moving to a different state while they were still in school, and they just lost touch. But unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last Neta heard from Pete, because he pops back up several years later. But in the meantime, Neta finishes school, she gets a job, and she is super involved in her church. She's very, very close with her family. Family and church are like the two most important things to her. And as Neta moved into her adult years, she started to envision what she wanted her life to be like. And the thing that she knew she wanted the most in life was to fall in love, get married, and have children. She had a very, very strong maternal instinct, and she 100% knew that she wanted to be a mother one day. However, Neta found out that she had a condition that made it impossible for her to have children. I'm not really sure what this condition was. All I know is that Neta's heart was broken, and she really struggled with this diagnosis. And now we're jumping ahead to 2010. Neta is 26 years old at this point, and she is living with her mother Yvonne in DC. And when Neta is not working or at church, she is typically on social media. And this is when her old high school crush, Pete Moses Jr., suddenly pops back up into her life. Pete sent Neta a friend request on Facebook, and she immediately accepts, and he and Neta started to reconnect. And Neta is so excited to hear from Pete. She always liked Pete, and at this point in her life, she's feeling very lonely. So she feels like this message could not have come at a better time. She discovered that Pete was currently living in Durham, North Carolina, and that he was a preacher, and he had built his own online ministry with a pretty decent sized following. He would upload videos to Facebook and YouTube, and this made Neta even more interested in Pete. You know, she has been looking for the love of her life for so long, and now her old crush pops back up, and he just so happens to be just as devoted to God as she is. Not only that, but he is also very family oriented, just like Neta. He even let a few of his sisters and their children move in with him. You know, they were going through a hard time. The fathers weren't really in the picture, and so he let them move in. And this made Neta like him even more, because obviously he was a really caring person. He was a family man. Pete was checking all of Neta's boxes. So on the surface, it seemed like he has grown up to be this really great guy. But that actually couldn't be further from the truth, because this was all an act. Pete had actually grown up to be a very sick and twisted, violent man. What he didn't tell Neta was that when he was in his early 20s, he and another person sexually assaulted a 12-year-old girl. Pete was convicted, and he was sentenced to 2 years of probation, which is an absurd sentence for such a horrific crime. And then a year later, he assaulted his own mother and 2 younger siblings, and charges were initially filed in that case, but they were later dismissed. So just based on those 2 incidents alone, we know that Pete is violent, and he is also a sexual predator. But that's not the only alarming thing about Pete, because it turns out that Pete's religious views were nothing like Neta's. Pete is a member of a movement called the Black Hebrew Israelites. And we're not going to get super into the weeds with the details of this group as a whole, because the main focus of this video is Pete and the cult that he created. But according to the Southern Poverty Law Center website, the Hebrew Israelite movement is a Black nationalist theology that dates back to the 19th century. Its doctrine asserts that African Americans are God's true chosen people, because they, not the people known to the world today as Jews, are the real descendants of the Hebrews of the Bible. Although most Hebrew Israelites are neither explicitly racist nor anti-Semitic and do not advocate violence, there is a rising extremist sector within the Hebrew Israelite movement whose adherents believe that Jews are devilish imposters, and who openly condemn whites as evil personified, deserving only death or slavery. So from what I gather, most of the members of this movement are not violent. They don't condemn other races, but they do have some factions that are very militant. They are extremist factions within the main group, and they condemn all other races and also members of the LGBTQ community. This is a very male-dominated group. The women are expected to be totally subservient to the men. They are also against birth control, and they encourage having as many babies as possible. There are a lot of fundamentalist type rules within the extreme factions of this group. And as you will see, Pete Moses definitely falls into the extremist category. These factions also preach about an impending apocalypse that will end in a violent race war. And I should also mention that some members of the Black Hebrew Israelites practice polygamy, because that is important for later in the story. So obviously Neta and Pete have very, very different religious views. Neta doesn't realize it, but she and Pete are polar opposites, and this relationship is just a disaster waiting to happen. But despite any reservations that Neta may have had, all of those old feelings started flooding right back. All the feelings that she had back in high school. And so she and Pete started messaging back and forth. They eventually start texting and calling all the time. And soon they were involved in a full-on relationship. And you have to keep in mind, this was a very vulnerable time for Neta. You know, she's very lonely. She really, really wants to get married. She's only 26 at this point, but she was probably feeling the pressure to get the next phase of her life going. And right now, Pete is showing her lots of attention that she's not used to getting. And so Neta threw herself into this relationship, and she started traveling from DC to Durham for visits on the weekends. And Pete at first was like a dream come true for her. He treats her really, really well. She loves every second that they spend together. She also gets along really well with his sisters and their kids. Like, everyone is super welcoming. Neta is unbelievably happy at this point in her life because she thinks that she's finally found the man that she was meant to be with. And this relationship moves very, very quickly. Within just a few months of them reconnecting on Facebook, Pete tells Neta that he wants to marry her, and he asks her to make the move from DC to Durham. He wants her to move in with him. And Neta says yes. Now, Neta's family were, of course, a little taken aback when they heard that she was moving out of state to live with this guy that she had just started dating. Her mom, Yvonne, was especially uncomfortable with the situation because she actually remembered Pete from back when they were in high school, and she never liked him. She has said that she doesn't know what it was exactly about him, but she just had a bad feeling, even when he was a teenager. And so she wasn't super happy about this relationship in the first place. But she also knew that Neta was an adult and she didn't want, to lose her daughter. And so she and the rest of the family just tried to be as supportive as possible. And so Neta packs up and she makes the move from DC to Durham, North Carolina to start the next chapter of her life. But as soon as she arrives, things start to go downhill. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, his sisters and their kids were living in his house. And this was a pretty decent sized house, but there's a lot of people living here. There are 4 women, not counting Neta, plus there were 9 children. So this house was very packed and everyone had to share bedrooms except for Pete. Pete had his own room, the biggest, nicest room in the house, while the women and children had to share, including Neta. Neta was not allowed to sleep in the same room as Pete. She had to move into a bedroom with 2 of his sisters, which I'm sure had to be a shock to her. Like, I'm sure that she assumed that she would be sharing a room with her fiance and not members of his family who are practically strangers to her. But she just did as she was told, and she started trying to make a place for herself within this family. But it became clear very quickly that Pete's family was not normal. They worshipped the ground that Pete walked on. Pete had his entire family convinced that he was a prophet. They all believed that he had a divine connection with God. They even referred to Pete as Lord, and they were expected to obey his every command without question. It became clear to Neta that everyone walked on eggshells in that house, and they all listened and obeyed everything Pete said. This was a very strange family dynamic, but perhaps the biggest surprise of all was revealed one night while everyone was sitting at the dinner table. As some of you may have already guessed, the 4 other women in the house were not actually Pete's sisters. They were his wives, and the children were in fact not his nieces and nephews. They were actually his biological children. Well, all of the kids except for one. There was a 4-year-old boy named Jaden who was not Pete's biological son, but we'll get more into that in a bit. So before we dive further into the story, I want to introduce the 4 other women in the house. So first, we have 40-year-old Lavada Harris, and Lavada and Pete had been together since 2006. Then we have 28-year-old LaRonda Smith, and LaRonda and Pete had been together at least since 2003, and they had 5 kids together. There was also a girl named Zana Thomas, and I don't have an exact age for Zana. We actually don't really know much about her at all because I'm pretty sure she was a minor when this case broke in the media. One source said that she was just a teenager, possibly as young as 16 years old, but I couldn't confirm that. And lastly, we have 25-year-old Vanya Sisk, and Vanya was seen as Pete's main girl. Like, she was the favorite out of all the women. Vanya and Pete had 3 kids together, and Vanya also had a child from a previous marriage, and that child was Jaden Higginbotham, the one that I mentioned earlier. Vanya and Jaden's biological father had separated after he came out as gay, and this is actually a very important detail later in the story. So as you can imagine, Neta was in total shock when she found out that she was not the only woman in Pete's life, and the women who she come to know as his sisters were actually his wives, and she had been unknowingly sharing Pete with all of them. And I really wish that Neta would have just walked away as soon as she found this out, but sadly she didn't. She was already under Pete's spell at this point. She was in love with him. The brainwashing and the manipulation had already started to take hold. And so when Pete asked Neta to become his 5th wife, she agreed. And this is the point in the story where the mask fully comes off. Pete made life in the house a living hell for everyone. He was extremely controlling. He had everyone in the house totally brainwashed to believe that he was a prophet and they had to obey him, because if they didn't, they were disobeying God. He was also extremely lazy. He forced all the women to go out and work while he stayed home and did nothing. He actually hadn't had a job in nearly a decade, and he was extremely violent. Everyone in the house was terrified of Pete. The women and children lived in constant fear. If anyone in the house ever disobeyed Pete, they would be brutally beaten. He also kept several guns around the house, and sometimes he would become so enraged, he would grab a gun and he would just start shooting at the women. He was also insanely sex obsessed. Like, he wanted the women to be ready and willing anytime he was in the mood. And he demanded that they have sex with him multiple times a day, and saying no was not an option, because if any of the women ever said no to sex, Pete would beat them black and blue. He would attempt to strangle them sometimes. He would pull a gun on them. They were basically forced to be his sex slaves. He would force them into very uncomfortable situations where they would have to have group sex. He would also force the women to have sex with each other while he watched. They weren't even allowed to question it. They just had to go along with it. And Pete would just be sitting back, watching them, telling them exactly what he wanted them to do to each other. It's safe to assume that Neta was regretting her decision very early on in the move, but there was one thing that did bring Neta some joy, and that was the kids. Neta was put in charge of homeschooling the kids because, of course, Pete refused to let them attend public school. And so all of the children, all 9 of them, were homeschooled. Neta was put in charge of that. And Neta loved getting to do this. Like, she loved spending time with the children more than anything. So she really took these kids in as her own, and she adored all of them. But she got especially close with Vanya's son, Jaden. She felt very maternal towards Jaden. And that was at least partly because out of all the kids, Jaden was targeted most by Pete. Pete could not stand Jaden for 2 reasons. First, because Jaden was the only kid in the house that was not biologically his, and Pete thought that since Jaden's biological father was gay, that meant that Jaden was also gay. He was convinced that this 4-year-old child was gay, and this made him hate Jaden. Pete literally referred to Jaden as an abomination, and he would constantly tell Vanya that she needed to get rid of him. And so Jaden was picked on by Pete a lot, and he would get into trouble for the smallest things. We actually don't know the extent of the abuse that Jaden went through, but family members who were not affiliated with the cult have said that after Jaden went to live with Vanya and Pete, he changed. They said that it was obvious that he was very afraid of Pete Moses. The family did end up calling CPS just to, report that they were worried about Jaden's well-being, but they never received an update, and Jaden remained in Vanya's custody. And as for Jaden's biological father, he did want to have a relationship with Jaden, but Vanya kept him away. And over time, Neta became more of a mother to Jaden than Vanya ever was. Neta was the one who was constantly trying to protect Jaden from Pete. Okay, so now we're jumping to October of 2010. Neta has been in the house for about 2 or 3 months at this point, which is crazy because it feels like a lot has happened in a really short period of time. Pete and Neta had only just reconnected at the beginning of the summer, and now here she is trapped in this abusive polygamist sex cult. And from this point in the story on, everything goes completely off the rails very quickly. So Neta had not told Pete that she was unable to have children, and so he had been expecting her to get pregnant. That is one of the cult's main goals, is to build up their own little army. And Neta started to panic because she knows that eventually Pete is going to start asking her questions, like why she hasn't gotten pregnant yet, and she's really afraid of him at this point, and she doesn't know what he might do. And so she comes up with this plan to just stall. If she can somehow stall him and get out of having sex for a while, then maybe that'll give her some time to kind of figure out what to do next. But like I said earlier, Pete does not accept the word no. He believes that women are literally put on this earth to please men. That is their only purpose. He would say things like women are to be owned like you own a pair of shoes, or like you own a dog. So one night in October of 2010, Pete asked her to come into his room so they can have sex. This was the routine. Like every night he would have a rotation of women that would be called to his room to have sex. And on this particular night, Neta really wanted to get out of it. And so she tells him that she's just not in the mood. And it does not go over well. Pete flies into a rage. He started beating Neta. He punched her so hard in the face that he knocked one of her teeth loose. He then grabbed one of his guns, put it to Neta's head, and he pulled the trigger. He is a psychopath. Thankfully, the gun did not go off. Did it jam? Was it not actually loaded? And this was just like a sick, twisted scare tactic? I don't really know. All I know is that it didn't go off. And after Pete was finished physically assaulting Neta, he then proceeded to sexually assault her. This attack pushed Neta over the edge, and this is kind of the point where she realized that she needed to get out before it was too late, because this man was psychotic and he was going to end up killing someone. And so that is what she did. One day she saw an opportunity. All the women were out working and Pete was in the shower, and so she grabbed what she could and she made a run for it. She ended up back in DC at her mother's house, and she told her family everything that she had been through. And of course they encouraged Neta to go to the police, but that just wasn't an option for her at the time. She was just way too terrified of Pete. He was so unhinged and he had already pulled a gun on her, and she just did not want to take a chance. But Neta's family was extremely happy to have her back, and they were just hoping that this would be the end of the relationship and they could just put this entire horrible experience behind them and move on. But of course, Pete could not let that happen. He felt like Neta was his property and she had no right to leave. And so he started bombarding her with messages and calls, begging and pleading her to come back to Durham. He was like making all these promises that he was going to treat her better and that it would be different. And when that didn't work, when Neta still said no, that's when he started threatening to hurt her or her family. Eventually, Pete's tactics worked, and 2 months after she had escaped, Neta very reluctantly returned to Durham. And this sadly would be the last time that Neta's family would ever see her alive. So it's now December of 2010. Neta has now returned to the cult house, and as soon as she arrives, she notices that Jaden is not there, and alarm bells started going off. Neta had been very worried about Jaden while she was gone. You know, Vanya never protected him. She was the only one that protected him in the house. So she was very eager to get back to Jaden, but now he was missing and she couldn't get a solid answer as to where he was. Vanya told her some vague explanation that he was staying with a babysitter, but that didn't really make sense. Like, why was he with a babysitter? But it wasn't long before Neta learned the true horrifying reason for Jaden's absence. One night after she overheard some of the women talking, 4-year-old Jaden Higginbotham had been murdered by Pete Moses. It all started one day in October, not long after Neta had escaped. The children were in a room playing around. They were like running around, just having fun, when LaRonda sees Jaden hit one of her sons on the butt, and she immediately runs to go tell Pete what she has just seen. Again, Jaden is 4 years old. They are little kids. They are playing around. Jaden slapping another kid on the butt means absolutely nothing, but no one in this group seems to have a grip on reality anymore, so this was seen as a very egregious incident. And so LaRonda runs and tells Pete that Jaden has hit her son on the butt, and Pete proceeds to flip the fuck out. He starts pacing all around. He's, cussing and saying all these things. He's in a total rage. This was his breaking point with Jaden. This poor little boy who had done nothing wrong. He had never done anything to deserve any of the abuse that he had been subjected to by Pete and the clear neglect and indifference from his own mother, Vanya. And now his short life was about to come to an end. Pete grabbed a .22 caliber handgun and he ordered the women, including Vanya, to set up a laptop and some speakers in the garage. He then forced Jaden into the garage and tells him to sit down on the ground, and he makes him listen to the Lord's Prayer in Hebrew blasted at a very high volume. And as Jaden is sitting there listening to the Lord's Prayer, Pete Moses, with Vanya watching, aims the gun at Jaden's head and pulls the trigger, ending his life. Pete then orders Lavada and LaRonda to clean up the blood, wrap his body in a plastic bag, and put him into a suitcase and store it upstairs in the attic. And then once the crime scene was all cleaned up and Jaden's little body was in a suitcase in the attic, Pete then orders Vanya into his room to have sex with him. Vanya is forced to have sex with the man who has just murdered her child. And we really don't even know what Vanya's thinking at this point. Does she even care? Was she even angry or upset that her son was dead? We just don't know. And after a few days of Jaden's body being upstairs in the attic, it was starting to decay and it started to smell. And soon the entire house has the stench of death. And Pete knew that it was time to get rid of the body. And so he and Vanya go and load Jaden's body into the car, and they drive a few streets over to Pete's mother's house. Her name is Shilda Harris, and they bury Jaden's body in her backyard. How anyone can do this to a child, especially a mother doing this to her own child, is impossible to fathom. It just shows how brainwashed these women truly were. And this just proves to Pete that these women are willing to stand by him through anything. He can even kill their own children and they still will not leave him. Which brings us back to Neta. So like I said, Neta one night overhears the women talking about Jaden's murder, and she is devastated. And she's also terrified because now she has confirmation that Pete Moses is capable of murder, and she knows that she needs to get out of that house immediately. So the second she sees her opportunity, she gets up. She has no shoes on. She's in a nightgown, but she bolts out the front door and she runs over to a neighbor's house and she starts banging on the door, begging to use this woman's phone to call for help. But unfortunately, Pete realized that Neta had run out the front door, and he knows that if Neta escapes again, she's probably going to go to the police, and that will be it for him and the cult. And so he sends two of the women out to go and grab Neta from the neighbor and drag her back inside the house. This neighbor literally watches as the women drag Neta kicking and screaming back inside the house, and she did nothing. I mean, I can understand maybe not wanting to physically get in the middle of all of this because you just don't really know what might happen, but she didn't even call police or anything. Later, when the neighbor was questioned about this, she said she thought Neta was a mental patient, and so she didn't think that she should call police. And once Neta was back inside the house, the torture began. First, she was beaten so brutally that she briefly lost consciousness. And then the four women and Pete all took a vote on whether or not Neta should be able to live or if she should die. And every single one of them voted that Neta should die. They first attempted to strangle her with a phone cord, but that didn't work. She kept regaining consciousness, and this is when Pete decided that Antoanetta was going to die the same way that Jaden did. They drag her to the upstairs bathroom. Pete once again orders the women to bring in his laptop and some speakers, and he started blasting the Lord's Prayer in Hebrew. But this time Pete hands the gun to Vanya, the same 22 caliber that he used to murder Jaden, and he orders Vanya to aim the gun at Neta's head and pull the trigger. But unlike with Jaden, Neta is very aware of what is about to happen to her, and she is crying and pleading for them not to kill her. She's literally begging for her life. But Pete could not care less. He only cared about protecting himself and keeping his twisted sex cult alive. He tells Vanya to finish the job, and she does. She pulls the trigger, ending Neta's life. Neta's body is then wrapped in a plastic bag, and she's eventually buried in Pete's mother's backyard, just feet away from Jaden's body. Now, a few weeks go by, and Neta's family back in DC is starting to get worried because they haven't heard from her, and that is not normal. Neta always stayed in touch, but she hasn't called, and she's also not responding to anyone's messages. So one day, one of Neta's siblings gets a hold of Pete, and they're like, "What is going on? Where is Neta? She's not answering our calls. We have not heard from her." And he tells them that she's fine. She's been working a lot of hours, and she just hadn't had time to call. Then right after that phone call, the family suddenly starts receiving text messages from Neta, but they are immediately suspicious because it doesn't sound like Neta. Like, the person sending these messages doesn't text the same as Neta does. Yvonne, her mother, said that Neta always ended their text conversations with "I love you," and whoever this was didn't do that. And so the family knew right away this could not be Neta. And so in February of 2011, they called police and they officially reported her missing. And of course, the first place that police check is the cult house in Durham because that is Neta's last known location. But Pete basically plays dumb. He tells police that he and Neta had broken up weeks ago. They were having fights about money and it just wasn't working out. And Neta had packed her bags and she left, and he had just assumed that she went back home to DC. Her family knew that this was not true. If they actually had broken up, Neta would have immediately returned home to DC. She was so incredibly close with her family. They were her rock. This explanation just did not make sense. But at that point, there wasn't really anything police could do because because Antoanetta was a grown woman and they had no evidence of foul play, and so their hands were kind of tied. But thankfully, someone was about to come forward, and this person blew the case wide open. Zana Thomas, the youngest of Pete's wives, had managed to escape. After Jaden and Neta's murders, she started to really fear for her own life. And she was also pregnant with Pete's child. This would actually be her first baby with Pete, and she decided that she needed to get herself and her unborn child out of that house. And so she runs to the police station one day and she starts telling them this wild story that she was a member of this cult, and the leader is this really terrifying, violent guy, and he has murdered 2 people. And when she tells them the name of the cult leader and the address to the cult house, police immediately realize that this is the same address and the same man that was linked to a missing person case, the Antoanetta McCoy missing person case. Now, Zana apparently didn't know that the bodies had been buried in Pete's mother's backyard. She thought that they were still up in the attic because that is where Jaden's body had initially been held. So she tells police that there are 2 bodies up in the attic, a 4-year-old little boy and a woman named Antoanetta McCoy. So police decided to go over to the house and just ask some questions and see if they can get a look around without a warrant. They decide to just go over there, kind of strike up a conversation, see if they can go inside and just kind of poke around a little bit. And so that's what they did. They head over to the cult house and they knock on the door, and Vanya answers. And the police are like, hey, we've received some information that some people who lived here are missing. Can we come in and take a look around? And surprisingly, Vanya agrees and she leads them inside. Now, when police walked in, they can see that in the main part of the house in the living room, Vanya and 2 other women, which were LaRonda and Lavada, were sitting there with all the kids. They had all gathered in the living room and Pete was not there. And so police just, start looking around and they aren't finding anything incriminating at this point. They're just kind of doing a preliminary search, and they do go up in the attic, but there are no bodies and they don't see a sign of a struggle or anything. But they did notice one thing that stood out. They knew from CPS records that there were 9 children living in the home, but police were only counting 8. Jaden Higginbotham was missing from the group. And when they asked Vanya about Jaden's whereabouts, she says that he's with a babysitter, and she even made up a fake name for this babysitter. Now, at this point, police are extremely suspicious. They're pretty sure that these people are lying and that they are responsible for Jaden and Neta's disappearances. But like I said, they didn't find anything in that preliminary search, and so they have no choice but to leave. But this is when they started talking to some of the neighbors, and one of the neighbors they speak to was the woman that Neta had ran to that night and was asking for help.
Did neighbors or anybody try to help her?
No, and this is what's really tragic, Dawn. She escapes. She goes to the neighbor's door. She's banging on the door and she says, please let me use your cell phone. I need to call for help. I need to get away. They're trying to kill me. She does nothing. She watches 2 women from that house drag Antoanetta back across the yard into that home. They beat her at the direction of the cult leader. They try and strangle her to death with an extension cord. And when that doesn't work, he gives the gun to Jaden's mother, the same woman who watched him murder her little boy 2 months earlier, and says, you shoot her in the head. And she does. And that neighbor says to police, I thought she was a mental patient, so I never called anybody or did anything.
This neighbor tells police all about that night. She said this woman who she didn't know ran to her screaming for help, and 2 other women dragged her back into the house. The neighbor did not know the name of this woman, but police were pretty sure that this was Neta, and so they just continued their investigation. Now, when Pete realizes that the police are starting to ask questions, he starts freaking out. He panics, and he makes the decision that they need to essentially go on the run. Pete, LaRonda, Lavada, Vanya, and the 8 remaining kids all pack up within a few days of that first visit from police, and they head to Colorado Springs, where Vanya's family lives, and they all move in with her grandmother. All 12 of them move into Vanya's grandmother's house. And it didn't take long for police to realize that they were on the run, because they went to the house to ask more questions and it was empty. And so a nationwide manhunt starts, and in the meantime, the police get to work combing through every inch of the cult house. And this time they found a lot of evidence. They found bullet holes. They found one that had gone through the bathroom wall, and the bullet was actually still lodged in the wall. They found traces of blood in various areas of the house that was later matched to Antoanetta. They also found Antoanetta's journal that detailed some of the abuse and just what her life was like in general while she was living with the cult, and it painted a very grim twisted picture. They also found Jaden's baby book, like the book with his newborn photos and little footprints and stuff that they do at the hospital. They found that in a trash can. So they found a lot of really good evidence, but what they really needed to find were the bodies. They were pretty sure that these people were not missing. They were pretty sure that Jaden and Neta were dead. And a few months later, in June of 2011, they finally got the call that they had been waiting for. Someone who was renting out a house in town had called a plumber because they started smelling a foul odor in their backyard. And when the plumber started digging, he discovered a dead body wrapped in plastic, and he called the police. This was Antoanetta's body, and after a little more digging, they eventually found Jaden's body as well.
It's devastating news for Jaden's father.
I went from anger to sadness to happiness back to sadness. I have a lot of mixed emotions, so I can't really even tell you which emotions that I'm experiencing right now because it's all of them.
It turns out that the house that the plumber was called out to, that was Pete's mother Shilda's house. But the family had recently moved out and the new owners had smelled this horrible smell and they called the plumber. There was no question at this point that the cult had murdered Jaden and Neta, and now police really needed to track them down and get these dangerous people off the streets. And thankfully, it did not take long for a tip to come in. Vanya's own grandmother called police and she was like, hey, all those people that you're looking for, they're living in my house. And finally, in June of 2011, Peter Moses, Vanya Sisk, Lavada Harris, and LaRonda Smith were finally arrested. They were all charged in the murder of Jaden Higginbotham and Antoinetta McCoy, and the prosecutors decided to seek the death penalty. But even under the threat of being put to death, the women still remained totally loyal to Pete. They stayed extremely tight-lipped about everything during their interrogation. They were not giving Pete up for anything. That is how incredibly brainwashed they all were. Pete was actually the first one who cracked because he didn't want to risk going to trial and getting the death penalty. He was concerned about himself. So he did confess to killing both Jaden and Neta, but he took the women down with him.
A Durham County grand jury has indicted 7 people in connection with the deaths of a woman and 5-year-old boy. 4 of them, Peter Moses Jr., Vanya Sisk, Lavada Harris, and LaRonda Smith, face murder charges in the death of Antoinetta McCoy. Moses was also charged with killing Jaden Higginbotham.
Prosecutors believe Pete Moses led a religious cult, took several women as wives, and lived here on Pear Tree Lane. They say he shot 4-year-old Jaden Higginbotham in the head simply because he thought the boy was gay. Detectives say Moses ordered others to kill McCoy because she wanted to go home. Her mother still has nightmares.
And then they try to choke her with a phone cord, and I mean, it's just, and wouldn't let her go. And for why? Why?
She described Moses as evil.
You lied to me. You deceived me. You said in the house, you told me you were going to marry her, that she was going to be okay. Where is she now? She's dead because of your calling, because of what you chose to do. You're going to have to live with this. You're not God. You're not God.
And in the end, Pete ended up pleading guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. Vanya Sisk was sentenced to 30 years for her part in helping to cover up her son's murder and for her part in the murder of Antoinetta McCoy. LaRonda Smith pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder, and she was sentenced to 23 to 30 years in prison. And Lavada Harris was sentenced to 24 years for being an accessory after the fact in both murders. Pete's mother, Shilda Harris, and his sister, Sheila, were initially charged for being accessories, but those charges were eventually dismissed. However, Pete's brother, Leonard Moses, pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact, and he was sentenced to 5 to 7 years. And I wish I knew more about Pete's brother Leonard and his involvement in this whole situation, but there really isn't much about him in the research since this case did not go to trial. I'm assuming that he helped to conceal the bodies at Pete's mom's house, and he likely knew all along that the bodies were buried there and he helped to cover it up. The only person who showed any true remorse for what happened was LaRonda Smith. She tearfully addressed the families in the court and she apologized for her involvement.
When LaRonda Smith admitted her role in the murders, she apologized and said she wishes she would have done things differently.
I was by myself down here.
That touched my heart. I literally wanted to get up and give her a hug.
She also said Antoinetta, quote, treated my kids like they were her own. And that comment really hit me because it just shows what a loving and caring person Antoanetta truly was. She took all of those kids in and loved them just like a mother should. Jaden's own mother didn't even love and protect him the way that Neta did. They had this really amazing person in their lives and they got rid of her like she was nothing. The surviving 8 children ended up in foster care, and I truly hope that they are in much better situations now. This story is just so heartbreaking and these murders were so senseless. And my heart goes out to the families of Jaden and Antoanetta. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen to start your Wild Green subscription. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, or leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.